Okay, this is going to be the first of my video podcasts concerning the visual appeal in a resume. At this point, I plan to have two video podcasts. I want to break it into two because I want to keep the files as small as possible and I want to keep the length as short as possible. But basically, what I'm going to focus on today is the sense of visual balance in a resume. Now, typically, when we talk about or when we think about resumes, we think about them in terms of content, understandably enough. We tend to focus almost exclusively on the data that goes into the resume and tend to forget that these are also visual documents, that before a reader ever actually reads them, the reader sees them. The reader responds to the visual appeal in the document. If something looks readable, if it looks attractive, the reader is much more inclined to take a closer look at the document. And generally speaking, even the first time that a reader looks at a resume, the statistics indicate that usually readers will only scan a resume the first time, spend about 30 to 45 seconds on a resume before they actually take a closer look at the information. And that little statistic can give you some insight into the fact that, at least initially, readers aren't paying real close, rigorous attention to the information. They are trying to locate necessary or essential stuff fast. And in order to do that, in order to help the reader do that, you've got to set up the document so that it's easy for a reader to find something, that the reader is comfortable in looking at the document. And that's where the visual appeal comes in. So I'm going to show you a couple of resumes. They are both actual resumes. One you have already seen. It's the sample skills resume. I'll get to that a little bit later. What you're seeing in front of you now is another actual resume. As you can see, I've removed all the personal information. It's not a resume of anyone in this class, so you don't need to concern yourself about this. But the first thing that I want to do to give you a sense of what I mean by visual balance in a resume is I'm going to do a little bit of drawing here. So bear with me while I get started here. And get the shapes. Okay. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a line down the center of the page, or at least as close to the center as I can possibly get, particularly using a mouse. There we go. Okay, now I'm going to draw a line horizontally across the resume. I'm not going to draw the line in the exact center of the resume. I'm going to try to draw the line roughly about a third of the way down. So that would be right about there. And that's good enough. Okay. Now, the first thing I'll point out here is that, as is pretty obvious, I've divided the resume into quadrants. One of the things that you want to look for in your own resumes is you want to see a resume that has roughly the same amounts of information in each of the four quadrants. Now, you have to take that very carefully. No one is asking you to count words or to pull out a ruler and measure. As you can see here, let me try to draw this a little bit more specifically, but as you can see in here, all right, there is a big white space there. All right, so to say that the four quadrants of this resume all have exactly the same amount and the same kind of information, that obviously would be false. And this is not a science. You don't need an exact measurement here. But visually, when you look at the document, what you want to do, or ideally your immediate reaction should be, from the looks of things, it looks like I've got equivalent amounts of information in all four quadrants. And if I don't, as up here, it's not large enough, it's not major enough to really cause any problems. Something like this, a big white space like this might be more of a problem, or would be more of a problem if you have it extended, for example, all the way down the right side of the document, or all the way on the left side of the document. Then that tends to throw off the balance here. But that's the first thing. Again, it's not something that you try to measure. It's something that you react to visually. Is there a balance? Is there not a balance? And the reason for the lines, and the reason for the horizontal line across, a third of the way down and across rather than down in the middle. Basically, what I'm doing here is creating what's called radial symmetry. And for one of the things you can do to see for yourself what radial symmetry is like is you can stand up, stand in front of a mirror, put both of your arms out, and just look at what you have. What you're seeing typically is radial symmetry. What you'll see typically is that on the left side of your body, you have stuff that's going to be replicated, duplicated on the right side of the body. Also, similarly, the reason why the horizontal line is drawn a third of the way through is because in the human body, the center of gravity for the body, the center of balance, is not the midpoint between the top of the head and the bottom of the feet. It's actually closer to the diaphragm. It's actually about a third of the way down rather than a half of the way down. So basically what you're seeing here is, using lines, a replication of something we are all very familiar with, and that is the radial symmetry, the radial balance of the body. This is not something I'm making up here. The reason why I do this, and the reason why you want to try to look at your own resumes this way, is that this is a little psychological device, that we are comfortable with things that look like us, and that's not really much of a surprise. And if the resume creates radial symmetry, if it creates visual balance, then readers tend to respond with a sense of comfort, with a sense of ease. The second thing about it is where the eye typically is drawn. And again, that's why the lines are drawn where they are here. The midpoint here, let me get that, right about here, is typically where the human eye is drawn. And what you try to do in the resume is, knowing that the eye is typically drawn to this area. Actually, I should, to be a little bit more precise, widen this a bit. Actually, it should be more like about there. Okay, as you can tell, drawing with the mouse is not particularly easy. But what you try to do when you put together your own resume, and this does pertain to content, is you want to try to make sure that the content that you identify as the most significant, what you think is going to be the strength of your resume, that's placed in a position where the eye is initially drawn. In other words, what you're trying to do is make sure, as best as you possibly can, that the reader at first glance at your resume sees the most significant information. So you'll notice in this particular resume that what the writer has done here is put her internships in the prime position in the resume. And as I've mentioned before in other posts, and you can find any number of articles about this online, an internship is one of the most powerful pieces of data that you can put on a resume. If a potential employer sees an internship, almost immediately they're going to start to look at your resume positively. Now, obviously that's not a guarantee, but certainly it helps a lot. So what this writer has done very simply is identified the internships as probably the most powerful pieces of data that she has, and she puts them in the optimal position in the resume. And the stuff that's going to be less optimal, such as server hostess, which is going to be irrelevant to the job, that gets shoved lower to the towards the bottom of the resume. And typically that's how we tend to respond to resumes. We tend to assume, rightly or wrongly, that as we get deeper into the resume, the information is, I don't want to say becomes less and less important, but it ideally or typically it's not going to be as significant as the stuff we place early on, assuming we are doing this smartly and putting the important stuff early on. We want to get their attention. We want to get their attention positively. And by putting the most powerful stuff in the optimal position, we're bettering our chances that the reader will see this. Let me just show you one more. This is the one that I had shown you earlier. But again, just quickly, because I don't think there's any need to go into any depth this one, because I'm more or less going to repeat myself. But if you just draw a line down the middle, and let me do this again, roughly about a third of the way down and across. Okay, and just one more. And let me highlight what is in the optimal position. And what you'll notice in the optimal position, first of all, generally she puts the skills section in the optimal position. Smart, very smart when putting together a skills resume. But secondly, notice, again, pretty obvious, but I'll point it out anyway. The skill that she features first, and the skill that is put in the optimal visual position on the resume, is communication skill. Again, you can find any number of sources that talk about this on the web, but in pretty much every list that I have seen of qualities and skills that employers look for in potential employees, communication, first of all, has always been on the list. And I would say, and yeah, I'm making up the number here, but just to give you a sense of what I've seen, I'd say in about at least 95, 99% of those lists, communication is at the top. So again, it's a smart move on the part of the person composing the resume. She takes a skills section, makes sure that's in the optimal position, visual position of the resume, and then fine-tunes it to make sure that the subsection of communication is in the optimal position of the resume, bettering the chances that a reader initially scanning the resume will be drawn to that, and so will be drawn immediately to the material that likely is going to be most beneficial to the applicant and most useful to the reader. So that's going to be the close of this particular podcast. In the next one, I'll talk a little bit more about structuring the resume. Again, it's a matter of visual appeal. But in that one, I'll get more into categories, subcategories, white space, graphic markers, that sort of thing. So that will close it for this particular podcast.